Hey there guys, so welcome to another lesson. This is going to be a lesson video for the sci-fi vehicle episode, and we're going to sort of do a deep dive into track by track what's happening in the in this Sparrow recreation, or not recreation, but redesign. And so basically I'll just start by showing you what this session is set up like, and sort of and by the way, if this audio in this video sort of crackles out or is poppy, I apologize. It's sort of a byproduct of my Mac trying to do all these, engine tracks and also record and record my mic at the same time. So if that happens, I apologize. There's not much I can do about it with this computer right now, but I did try to freeze the most intense tracks just so we could get some of the CPU load off. But again, I apologize if it doesn't work. It should be all right though. The content should be unaffected. So yeah, I'm just going to show you this session and go track by track, and we'll talk about sort of techniques that I used here. Some things that I like about this design, some things I don't like about this design, best practices that, or at least, my best practices for doing stuff like this. So the first thing I want to just talk about is the session. I set up, this is the way I set up all my video design sessions. I put the video up on the top. And I got this capture. This is just some gameplay of Destiny 2. When I recorded this gameplay, it was like kind of funny because I originally recorded a bunch of versions of me getting onto my Sparrow and then driving off. But this one I thought was the worst because I fly off a rock, which was like a strange part. I should have been on the ground the whole time, and then I boost, and then I actually do another boost by accident here, right there, and then I hit a rock, and then I go into a cave, and I was like, okay, this is too much stuff. I don't want to do all this. So then I went back later and realized all these little moments are actually cool chances for me to show what, a parameter in game might do in a situation like that. So for example, flying off the rock, you can do height above ground modifications to the engine. Like, it's not working as hard because it's not flying directly on the ground. It's not in contact with the ground, stuff like that. The double boost, I could show like a secondary boost or not a full boost activation. I can show sort of what a backfire would sound like. And then when you drive into the cave, I can change the convolution reverb, and then I can show over here with the physics sounds what it would sound like to hit the wall in the cave. So all that stuff ended up actually being a boon to the creation of this video. And so I picked this clip and I got to designing. So this section over here, this moon category, this gray track right here, all it has is my mastering, sort of like an ozone patch, and then the two convolution reverbs that I'm running to send all of these outdoor effects to. So basically that's what this group track is for. And then within this group track, I have everything else. So this is the ambience, the spawn vehicle sound, the Foley, the engine, the nitrous, the physics sounds. So yeah, this is, I'll go track by track. I want to first go group by group and solo the groups, and then play what the whole clip sounds like all the way through. And then we'll go through and we'll discuss each group in detail, show what the layers are like, and show all that stuff. So this is going to be the start of that lesson. So here's the moon category. Here's what the entire clip sounds like all together. One more time. Cool, and here is the spawn vehicle sound solo, or actually, here's the ambience track soloed first. Okay, and here is the spawn vehicle sound, the vehicle materialization sound, you could say. Here is the Foley. Here is the engine. Here is the boost, the sort of nitrous element. And then a sort of backfire or a smaller nitrous boost later. And here is the physics sounds layer, the last layer. So let's start with the ambience. The ambience is really important in this video, and it's important that I like to do it first when I'm designing stuff like this. And the reason I like to do it first is because it's really tough to design on top of silence. It's tough to, pick a clip and then start designing the engine because you don't feel like you have any context and you don't feel like what you're designing really sits anywhere or sits well in the mix of what you're doing because there is no mix. It's just a solo isolated sound. And this is not true for, for example, for like GUI sounds or for, simple Foley, things that are, even footsteps actually. You can use this technique. But what I like to do is make an ambience track and use it as a bed for the mix of the design so that I can tell how my sound is going to play against that ambience. So, for example, sometimes if you make a gunshot sound and then you make a really dynamic, really, with a lot of dynamic range, you make this gunshot with this cool punch and this long kind of detailed sci-fi tail. Sometimes you make that, and then when you put it in the game or put it in the mix of whatever it is you're working on, that cool detail and that shimmeriness of the tail all gets lost because the ambience is louder than that. And I don't like when that happens, and it kind of frustrates me because I'm like, of course I should have just designed with ambience in mind. So one tip that I like to do is to design an ambience track from the get-go and just say, here's what I'm going to work against. Sometimes, and I have this little music thing enabled. This it's actually doesn't appear in the episode. It's just a music track for context as well. But an ambience, a music track, whatever you have to do to contextualize the sound you're designing for, really helps in getting you to design something more appropriate, at least dynamic range-wise. So that's something that I did in this episode. The first thing I did was just make an ambience track and then start designing on top of that. It doesn't even matter if you use it in the final design. It's just a great thing to add context. So the first thing that the first thing I designed after that was the engine, but the spawn vehicle sound was one of those things that I was really excited to dive into because it was kind of so abstract. If you look at the visual is very digital. It's almost like the sparrow just loads in from like a 3D model. It's like it's not any there's nothing physical about it. It's just like this is technology just loading this sparrow into existence. So I didn't want the sound. I like this visual, but I didn't want the sound to be just entirely digital. I didn't want it to be like a loading bar or something like a GUI sound. I wanted to still be physical. So I felt like the hybrid between that would be like a synth patch or something like that. Something that has low end to signify that this is like a couple 100-pound object, and then something like a jet engine, like this roaring jet engine, or a an air pump or an air hiss sound, to signify that this is like has a lot of tiny little digital moving parts that has like a lot of high end shimmer to it. So this is what that sound came together sounding like. Again, then we'll break down the layers after this. So first we have these three Boom Library construction kit, Magic construction kit sounds. These are all from the same sound, but they're all pitched differently. These are just like sort of synth pulses that I layered together. They sound like this individually. So those are as digital as I get with this design. Those are going to be there to give us that digital feeling. But I don't care necessarily, those are just like fun detail. I want the rest of this to actually be able to hold its own without those, just because that's kind of like the added texture. And the layers that are after this are all the physical layers, the layers that give it weight, the layers that give it a sense that it has a jet functioning in the back of it, and those sound like this together. So the thing about those layers, if we go solo through them, the thing about those layers is that I want them to sound like we're starting to do something, not that we're finishing doing something. So like, for example, this fan power down sound originally actually sounded like this. This sound is a reversed version of it, but originally this sound was pitching down because it was a power down sound. And this would be great for, getting off your Sparrow, but it's not great for getting on your Sparrow and starting, to do something cool like ride this cool sci-fi vehicle. So what I first did was reverse it and let it pitch up over time, because that sort of like builds you emotionally up into this thing like I'm doing something cool. I'll show you what an A-B would sound like of this materialization sound with this fan power down normally pitched and then reversed. So here's what it sounds like, what it would sound like without the reverse. Still texturally very similar, and obviously, maybe you wouldn't exactly get a comment from someone that says this is ridiculous. What is this sound? It doesn't fit right. But it does sound a little bit wrong. It sounds, it doesn't sound exciting. But when you reverse it and you let the pitch up happen, this is what it sounds like now. It really feels like it's building into something. And the same is true of this, jet roaring engine here. I want this to feel like it's sort of like building up and powering up. You can see that subtle pitch up in that as well. This actually has a subtle pitch down, but it's more like a flat sound. And then this air hiss down here is just sort of like I said, that high-end detail. All of these have different levels of effects and EQ on them. The EQ typically is just to remove things that I feel don't fit rather than add things that I think fit very well. So for example, like this air pump hiss sounded like this before. It sounds a little like hollow. It sounds kind of like someone's like squeezing a dog toy or something. It doesn't sound quite right. But then with the EQ, I'm able to just take the section of it that fits more for this engine and then keep that. That's one thing. And of course, it's different for every level of sound designer when approaching tasks like this. But when you're working with an EQ, very often the right answer is to remove and not to add. So I take that approach with layers typically here as well. Like if I hear something in my sample library that I think is cool, but I think I would have to boost the EQ like crazy to get there, I think I'm just probably not working with a sample that's good enough. So that's something that I typically make sure is, that I'm not adding a bunch of frequencies with EQ. Now there are exceptions like this layer, I think here, yeah. This just had a really cool low mid resonant like sort of warble that I really liked. So I accentuated it there. Not the end of the world, but just using that sparingly is pretty important, I think. So yeah, here's what the spawn vehicle sounds like again all together. I think in the end it sort of is a hybrid between like the visual and then like a real, jet engine power on sound like you'd hear if you clicked it and it started up. And I think that's a cool balance to strike, because I didn't feel comfortable doing a fully digital version. It just didn't quite feel right. It felt too kind of manufactured. So that's the version that I ended up with. Now the Foley. So this is kind of the least interesting layer as far as sound design techniques go. But it's pretty interesting just as far as like, approaching sound design from a more, I don't want to say philosophical, approaching sound design with just a visual image. It's kind of important to get an idea before you start of what kind of things would be appropriate in that situation. And I think Foley, especially in sci-fi games, is always a good chance to do that. So it'd be fun to practice. Like for example, if you see a cool suit of armor in a game that you like, just capture some footage of it and try to design Foley for it. It's always a challenge to strike the balance between metallic but also nylon and cloth. It just depends whatever the suit of armor is made of. And in the case of Destiny, if we zoom in on a few frames here, we can kind of see that the armor is very metallic, but it also has this sort of like futuristic plastic feeling. It's almost like the elements that, are on the shoulders and pads there, it doesn't look like they're quite metal. It almost looks like they're a shiny blue plastic, like a hybrid maybe plastic. I don't know, who knows what's happening in the world of Destiny, but Yeah, so over here, so I didn't really want to go like Anvil classic, Acme, like bing, stuff like that, like Roadrunner kind of sounds. But I did want to do something that felt weighty and that something like that sort of felt like it was, gonna protect me from something. So this is what I ended up with, these 5 layers. So it has that weight, but it doesn't have like the dink 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 sort of metallic shimmery stuff, but this layer, here's what the soloed layers sound like. This is the there's a backpack sound, there's a mountain bike, there's actually an explosion in there, like a little fire explosion, more backpack, plastic layers, and then a blanket swish. So here's what they sound like all together, or soloed rather. The 2 layers that I think are the most important here are the last 2. The plastic layer it gives you that element of like a bunch of plastic shoulder pads sort of rubbing together, almost like football, equipment. And then this last layer sort of conveys the movement. As it's like the swish. It's the sound of you moving through the air and actually getting onto the bike. The rest of the elements, in particular these 2 Foley layers here, the ones that I showed earlier, this mountain bike land, and then the explosion magic layer, those are there to almost just provide the weight. They're not really there for texture as much as they are to show you that this guy probably weighs like, 200 pounds with all this armor on, or maybe more than that, and he's hitting a bike that's made of metal, so it's just there to show the weight. So that plays into those 2 layers like this when you add the swish and the plastic. So then we have on top just more backpack elements, more of the armor jangle. And those tie it all together. So Foley is that, it's the kind of thing where, because you're not often, editing these samples heavily in the same way that you would the engine for the vehicle, for example, you got to have good samples. It's tough to work around that, and you can record your own samples, or you can find a cool library. The library that I use a lot is this A Sound Effect cloth Foley library. There's a lot of stuff in here that just ends up being super useful. It's just very general, and that's what kind of why I like it. There's a lot of cool backpacks in there, some cool leather handling. It's overall just a very good general Foley library, so that's why I use it for a lot of stuff like this. A lot of cool fleece. And yeah, so that's the Foley layer. I also wanted to make this layer mono because I wanted to make the, leave room in the stereo image for the things that really should be there, which is like the fun, interesting sci-fi sounds, especially in, as far as wideness goes. Because just sort of like you can't have 2 very loud bassy sounds playing at the same time and have it not become muddy. It's kind of rough to try to make everything sound very wide, because then the mix just sounds kind of uncontrolled. So anything that even tempts me to make it mono, I usually make mono, because I want to leave as much room in the wider parts of the stereo image for the things that are going to be more fun when they're there, like for example the spawn vehicle sound. But either way, I do actually, one thing that I missed when talking about this sound, after the delay and this proximity plugin, which is just there to sort of like spatialize the sound, I throw in a utility in Ableton, or you can do it in Reaper with a stereo enhancer, or in Pro Tools with God knows what. I don't use Pro Tools, but you can do this in any DAW, just making the bass mono. So what the cool thing about Ableton's utility is that you can make everything below a certain frequency mono. So I pick 500 hertz just because I wanted to give the low mids, I wanted to tighten those up too. But everything above 500 hertz is allowed to, inhabit the stereo image the way that it appears in the tracks. So that's a cool way to do that. I like to do that on tracks I like to do that on almost everything. I actually think I'm doing it on the master. Nope, I'm not. But I do that on the master of a lot of cutscene work. Like for example, if you're designing to a video for your reel or something and you want to tighten up the low end of your mix, I think that's a great thing to do. Make the bass mono, at least play around with the stereo image like that on individual tracks, because it does provide a lot of room to use later. So the next thing that I want to look at, I'll skip the engine and the nitrous because those are the kind of most involved sounds, and we'll go to the physics sounds. Like I said in the beginning, the physics sounds were something that I didn't intend on designing originally, but it kind of is a cool, it was a cool way for me to show what the convolution reverb profile sounds like. Because we had no, before I started to design this, there were no, once you enter the cave, there's no transient sounds that really would activate the convolution profile in a way that you would be able to hear it meaningfully, because it would just be like, oh, the engine changed a little bit when you went in the cave. But this actually shows off what convolution reverb sounds like. And here's the convolution reverb off. Cool. So yeah, so this is this sound is pretty simple. It's a sort of a classically, similar to the spawn vehicle sound. It's classically just like layered with sounds in my sample library. One thing that I've found with physics sounds in general is that I tend to over design them because I would almost rather control the intensity level of this crash with volume than I would with design. And I guess that's kind of a roundabout way of saying it's really easy to turn something down, but it's not always easy to turn something up and still have it sound good. So I'll let you listen to these layers solo, and then I'll talk more about what I mean by that. And actually, I'm going to go through these solo without the tunnel verb on, just so you can hear what the samples are like. So these are pretty simple sounds. Like I said, they're just simple physics sounds, like a fender scrape sound, a car accident, your typical metallic physics sound, stuff like that. But if you really listen to the whole sound together, it's a much more intense crash than the actual visual effects or the actual video would lead you to believe. So you can kind of see in the video here, if we just slowly zoom in, it's kind of like, okay, the front right corner of the Sparrow hits the rock wall, and then you scrape off it a little bit, and okay. But this sound, if you listen to it solo and tried to picture what that would be, it's much more physical. It impacts much more hard, and that's intentional. So it's like I was saying, it's kind of harder to design something quiet and subdued like that and then have it sound good in a game, because you're competing with the engine of the vehicle, you're competing with the ambience of the environment. So it's kind of I usually will over design physics sounds like this, physics impacts, and then turn them down just to make them sound less intense. Because if I were just to mute all of these layers and just, for example, use this little fender scrape sound, if you listen to that in the context of the mix, it's kind of weak. And it doesn't really work because, even if that's kind of what the visual would suggest to you, there's still like the player playing this game who's controlling, 500 pounds worth of armor and a vehicle, who hits the wall and goes, oh, it kind of felt flat. So I over design sounds like this and then turn them down. Because it's much harder to do that, or it's much easier to do that than it is to design a wimpy thing that fits the visual and then turn it up to the point at which it would make sense. It just, it's something that happens a lot. And, when I realize later, or at least it's something that's happened to me a lot, where I've designed something and then gone back and realized later that it sounds wimpy and that I need to make it more rowdy and crazy. So yeah, that's the physics sounds layer altogether. I'll play that again solo. And now we have the engine and the nitrous sounds. So these sorry for them being blue. I froze them to save CPU. But yeah, so we should still be able to get everything out of these we need. I'll start with the engine sound. So the engine sound was made of recordings that I got from my room. Some of them actually, yeah, no, all these were from my room. The other recording that I got was from my friend's dishwasher door, but I didn't use that in this. I used just the air conditioned recordings in the engine. Actually, I'll play the engine again from scratch. We'll listen to it solo, and then I'll break down what's exactly happening. Cool. I'm going to duplicate the engine and drag it off to the bottom because I don't want to screw up the actual engine. I just want to demo parts of the engine, guys, without worrying that I'm going to delete all my work. Okay, so here's what the engine looks like. It's 4 layers. There's a sub-bass layer that sounds like this. There's a main engine layer that sounds like this. There's a hiss track, which is actually a MIDI track, which is playing a sampler with a looping sound in it, with the air conditioner looping sound in it. And then there is the rocket pop layer, which I don't know why I called it that, but it's the almost, it's the unaffected recording of the air conditioner in 3 different perspectives. It's kind of like the rocket engine layer. Cool. So let's go one by one. The sub bass is just there for the burst section. I wanted to add a sub bass layer that really sort of increased the weight of everything when it came time to go into boost mode, because you want that extra bass. It almost feels more cinematic and more intense when you go into that mode. There's a pretty strong fade in though, and that's intentional. That's to prevent the nitrous sound, which is down here, which takes place over the same period of time. It's to prevent the low end of that with conflicting too much with the low end of the sub bass layer. And then as you see, when it fades out here is when the vehicle slows down again. So that layer is there just pretty strictly for weight and for, the ability to add that extra bass thump when you're in the intense mode. And it's honestly just the air conditioner sound. I think pitch down 6 semitones with an EQ and a compressor, and that's all it is. Actually, no, it also has there's a chorus effect on there as well. And it is modulated the same way as far as gain goes as the main engine itself, and we'll talk about that when we get to the main engine. So it's basically just a low-passed version of the air conditioner that's been beefed up. Now, the hiss track, we'll talk about the main engine last. The hiss track is, I've never tried this method before, but I actually ended up loving it. I picked a looping sound from the air conditioner recording, which sounds like this. I'll unfreeze this. Oh no, not flatten. I didn't mean to flatten. I will unfreeze this. Yeah, so this is the looping section that I got. So I'm just using it on a simple looping sampler. As you can see, I can play it like a keyboard on my I can turn on type mode and I can play it like a keyboard. And the reason I did this, the reason I tried this implementation versus just throwing this looping sound in here and then controlling the pitch with the plugin, is that I can actually avoid creating artifacts. I can avoid, stretching the sound when I repitch it. So I can just have the loop, increase its rate without actually changing or stretching the sound when it pitches down. If you do pitch it down a lot, then you can obviously create artifacts. But when you pitch it up, it's just a very natural pitch up, and it's not trying to create frequencies where there weren't frequencies before. So that's one thing that I wanted to try, because I thought it'd make a sort of smoother experience. And also you have the added benefit of, because I want it to pitch up when when the speed increases. So it allowed me to just play this out on a keyboard as if I was like, performing the speed of the vehicle, and then the pitch just takes care of itself. So I can say, oh, okay, there's a little moment here where you get on and I want it to be a little higher pitch at first, so I throw this MIDI note in here, and then I have it fade back down with a, in the sampler, I have a glide time, so it's gliding down, down from the previous note pretty smoothly, so it's not just going to go, it's going to go like an engine would. So I'm treating this like the RPM. I'm just trying to capture the RPM with MIDI notes. And then we can get up to the point where so I added these 2 notes here because it's like strenuous getting up the hill. And then when you get to the top of the hill, I want it to level out. And then when you fly off the hill, I wanted the engine to sort of like hiss even higher. So it goes up in intensity because it's almost like it's almost like a bike when the wheels like lift off the road and you're not necessarily touching the ground anymore, the wheels would spin much faster, right? So I wanted to emulate that kind of a feeling. And so I increased the speed to almost boost levels of intensity when you fly off the ridge. And it sounds like this, actually. Just I'll play for you the first few moments here. So it's pretty subtle, but I think it helps in the illusion. And then we get into the boost section, which is just this straight up, octave shift up in the note. And added some variation at the beginning where I thought it would be fastest, and then it goes subtly back down while it's losing speed, and then the boost turns off, and then we go straight back into normal idle mode with a subtle shift at the end with this note here signifying that the player is moving to the right. So that's sort of like another shift. I'll let you listen to the whole thing again. So that little extra EQ automation in there was for the boost. I wanted to sort of make it seem like a bunch of gas was leaving the back and then catching fire. So I added that little automation. You can see in the EQ in the bottom, you can see that going crazy with the gain. And if you take a look at the automation, the same thing happens in here. EQ8. So this is the gain of that EQ. Don't worry, we'll touch that later. Oh, you know what? No, actually, we'll touch that right now. We'll go right into engine air conditioner sound. So, oh no, let's do this. Let's do this first. Okay, so the waveform air conditioner. What's this? This is the Rocket Pop layer. This is like I said, the physical layer. It's the unaffected recording. So I wanted it to just be there. I kind of love the one thing that I really like is the sounds of those NASA recordings. I don't know if I have them on my computer anymore, but there's these rocket engine recordings that really just sound poppy and cool. I think there are some in the Odyssey Essentials, but this is kind of what I'm talking about. But really what it is just a really warm, natural, distorted rocket sound. Yeah, that's not it, but it's kind of like it kind of just sounds like putting wind through distortion, except it's like naturally occurring crazy rocket sounds. But I love that sound. I don't know why I love it, but I love it when people use it in like jetpacks and stuff like that. I think it's a really cool sound. It's like constant popping and crackling from the rocket, just ripping through the air. I really like those sounds. So I wanted to emulate that. And the best way I knew how was to just put my iPhone mic directly up next to my air conditioner, the fan and the air conditioner. So that's what I did. It came out sounding like this. I got a few different perspectives for, for example, just normal riding and then the boost. So it doesn't quite have the same power that a rocket engine would, but I tried my best to accentuate the parts of it that sounded most like a rocket. And the way that ended up turning out was with this overdrive, which you can see as I scroll along here. If you take a look on the overdrive on the left, and I'll unfreeze this so it's not annoying to look through the blue. If you just look through look at this overdrive and how it's reacting to the speed, you can kind of see that I'm increasing the frequency that the overdrive is operating at with the speed of the vehicle. So the overdrive originally is distorting very low, and then as we increase speed, it's distorting more high mids. And that's just to add movement. I don't know that that necessarily conveys some sort of like accurate difference in the speed of a rocket or anything, or what you'd experience if you were seeing a rocket lift off in real life. But I know that it just adds that little extra definition between the two different main speeds in the clip. It just adds a nice little layer of movement, and that's one thing that happened a lot in this entire design, where I was just looking for things that were sitting there, like parameters that were just sitting there sort of idly, and then thinking, okay, is there a way to add movement to this, or a way to automate this in a way that seems more like a rocket, or like that suggests more change in the sound. And what that ended up being was just automating things like, the highs of an EQ, and adding more highs when the Sparrow rather boosts, and then changing the filter frequency, stuff like that. It's hard to sort of like teach rules of thumb for these kinds of designs, because everything is so case by case with sci-fi vehicles, but anything sci-fi really is just a matter of intuiting sort of what you think would happen in the world that you're looking at, and going, okay, this gun fires this way, and I think that would have an effect on the pistons I see rotating around because of the XYZ, because they'd be getting hotter, so I'd want more steam coming off of them, stuff like that. That's sort of the crux of what this layer is. It's just me going, okay, this is kind of boring. Can I make it more interesting? Throw a distortion on there, change the frequency. Things like that are important to adding variety to what you're doing. So let's get rid of these. Get rid of the sub track. I want to save my computer from all this processing. Unfreeze this. Now this is the main engine. So this is the same air conditioner recording as the other layers, but it's going through a host of effects that the others are just not. This is what the engine sounds like on its own. So the original way that I went about this was I was trying to think about it in terms of a game engine. Just trying to think of, okay, if there were parameters controlling this, what would those parameters be? And we talk about that more in the episode, so I won't get totally into it here, but that's kind of what I'm trying to emulate. And the only way to emulate that in real time with the DAW is to use automation, or not in real time, but the only way to emulate that in a DAW is with automation. You can't, for example, import a parameter from a game engine into Ableton and try to do it that way. So what I did was have two basic macros in this audio effects rack. And what a macro is just a knob that controls many other knobs in the same effects unit. So every effect that I put in here, and we'll talk about them more in a second, is just being controlled by these pitch and rate macro knobs. So what I mean by rate is the rate of the auto pan, or the tremolo, or the wobbling of the volume effect on some of these effects. And what I mean by pitch is basically speed. So however fast the vehicle is going, I want the pitch to correspond to that speed. And so I've automated pitch and rate. Now, in addition to that, so if you haven't taken a look in Ableton to pitch and rate, or to effects racks rather, you can see pitch and rate control, for example, the pipe resonator, this effect that I'll talk about in a second, the tune, the material, the brightness, and you can set ranges for it. And there's no handbook that'll tell you what to do here. This is just a matter of playing back and then going, okay, 19 is not good, 100's better, 17 is not great, minus 100 is better, or 66 is better. You just got to mess around with this kind of stuff. It's almost impossible to know what this is going to sound like before you get in and start messing with it. But those mapped macros control a lot of what's going on in the effects. And I just want to walk through what exactly these effects are. So first we have an LFO. This is not stock in Ableton. This is an Ableton Max for Live thing. And this LFO basically is here to modulate with, regularity. It's supposed to modulate a parameter rather than, you could always actually, with Ableton's new automation features, you could go in here and select a section and you can do some fun stuff like inserting actually no, we'd have to do this in a separate channel. We'd have to go like this. We could go, I want to insert a shape here. I want to insert a sine wave. Come on. I think it's because my bars are not on. Oh no, we can't insert a shape. I don't know why we can't right now. Oh, it's because the parameter's not. So we can actually go in and say, in Ableton, we can go add an EQ8. We can add a shape. We can say, oh, I want a sine wave, or I want 20 sine waves, or I want to do, I want to modulate this parameter like this and have it be a constant sine wave. You can do it that way, or one way that I prefer, instead of messing with automation for everything, I like to I like to automate automation as much as I can. So what I do is add LFOs. And what the LFO allows you to do is just say, okay, here's the parameter I'm controlling, and here's the rate I want to turn it up and down, and here's the depth that I want to turn it up and down at, and all sorts of other things that really make it a lot easier than just doing things with automation. So that's one of the first things that I did, is add an LFO, because I knew that I was going to use it. Then the next thing that I do is this plugin called Corpus. This plugin is really interesting. It's kind of a material resonator plugin. I don't fully understand it, but I know what it sounds like. It's kind of case with a lot of plugins for me. I don't really quite know what it does, but I kind of know what it ends up doing to the sound, and I think that's more important. So this is the beam setting. This is basically, you select the material in this section right here, and then basically you can just decide how you want the material, how bright you want the material to be, how long you want the material to resonate for, what note you want the material to resonate at with this tune function here, the stereo spread, how much how many inharmonics there are, or how many sort of like random harmonics there are, I guess you would say, how sort of out of tune it sounds. Listening left and right, I have no idea what those do. Hit, I have no idea what that does. And then the dry wet. So that's all I'm using here, is just this pipe resonator plugin, and basically it brings the sound from, I'll show you before and after what it does to the sound, but it adds all of its metallic resonance with the pipe resonator plugin. So here's what it sounds like before, and then after. So yeah, it's very much just a metallic effect. It's kind of all it does, and it's the crux of this engine, because if I were to just not, it adds the sci-fi element to the engine. It adds the the future tech element to it. So without it, the engine sounds quite boring. It sounds really just like a rocket or like a hissy kind of thing. But when you add the pipe resonator, it's kind of what brings this from A to B. And I apologize for, like, usually these lessons are I try as much as I can to have effects or examples of effects that are available in every DAW, or something that would be applicable to someone using Reaper or anything else. But Ableton has this pipe resonator preset on the Corpus plugin, and that's what I used, and that's what I built the main sound from. So it's kind of one of the rare examples where this is actually exclusive to Ableton. So then next I have the Yo Man preset from this chorus plugin, and I think basically the preset itself had an interesting sort of amount of chorus and a rate, and this polarity. But one thing that wasn't quite hitting for me was the feedback, which, when I think the preset is quite short. If I check here, Yo Man. Yeah, so it's quite, no, it's actually 74. So it's quite high at the beginning, which is it's almost like over encumbering when you first listen to it. I'll show you what it sounds like. It's just too chorusy for me. It's too, in your face chorusy. It's like, it sounds too much like that. It sounds like it sticks around for too long. So, but I do like the texture that it adds. So that was one of the things that I decided to automate. It's another one of those parameters that if we look at feedback, where is it? It's down here, somewhat down here. No, gotta add it. Oh no, it's actually controlled. Yeah. So it's being controlled right now by the pitch of the of this macro. So this macro basically takes this dry wet parameter from a minimum of 0 all the way up to a maximum of 30 at the highest pitch. So you can see as we play it back, you'll watch the you can watch the feedback knob automate over time, which is something that I kind of liked because it adds an extra element of sort of sci-fi texture during the boost. But when we're floating around at like 2 miles an hour, it doesn't add like this huge sci-fi frequency, this resonant yo man kind of like preset, because I that's kind of like, it's almost too on the nose. It's too sci-fi and in your face if I were to do that. So it's kind of like a subtle layer that gets added in once the boost is active. So then next I have a compressor, and this is very simple. It's just a compressor to reduce the dynamic range between the two basic modes of this sound. One, being obviously the intro where it's moving very slowly, and then the second being super fast boost mode, and then back down again to quiet mode. So then I have utilities, and these utilities are basically here to regulate the balance between this engine sort of when it's in low speed mode and high speed mode. And what I mean by balance is just the mid-side spread. So the engine is in mono up until the point at which you go into boost, and then it goes slightly less into mono. It doesn't go quite full into full stereo, but it does spread out a little bit more. I kind of thought that would be a cool way to leave a little bit of extra surprise for the listener when they go into boost mode. It's kind of like it's like the cherry on top. It's like going, okay, like, the engine sounds cool in the beginning, but then we really spread it out a little bit further when you go into boost mode, and then it's like, oh, okay, this is kind of it leaves space for the audience to be surprised when there are more exciting things happening. So I automated the mid-side balance. It's just automated very simply over time. When you go into boost mode, it increases back to 58. And then, but I didn't actually kick it back into full because I did think that was too much. I thought it was just too spread out wide. And then there's another utility here controlling just a subtle, not subtle. It's actually pretty intense, but it's controlling the gain difference between the different stages of the launch here. So in the beginning, it's loud. Then as we go up the hill, it gets a little bit less intense. And then when we fly off the hill, the engine ducks down quite a bit to simulate, again, the engine not having to work because the vehicle is not making contact with the ground, similar to the way we approach the MIDI notes in the hiss layer. And then boosts back up to full volume with a increase in volume for the turn when you turn around. And then another turn here, and then we fade back out. Another thing that I did was automate the LFO amount for this chorus effect when you turn. So that was one of the things I was struggling with this design. Was originally when I made this, I had extra tracks that were extra added layers for turning. When you tilt left and right, I wanted to add another element in that was like cutting through the air, kind of like a kind of sound. But it just wasn't quite fitting right, and I didn't feel great about it. So I tried to do this. I tried to just recreate a similar effect with the actual automation for that particular moment, like in the clip. So if you scroll past, I'm gonna get rid of these track lines again. If you go past this moment in the clip, you notice that as I turn, as I bank, there are a few things in here that are not pitching up, but automating up. So you see this LFO amount in the chorus automate up. You see a slight automation up in the pipe resonator's decay amount. And what that means is how long the pipe resonator effect lingers on. So it's almost like an increased kind of metallic resonance that happens there. And then the gain actually increases there too. And the pitch of the entire motor increases there as well. So you can hear, if you listen back, you can hear when the turn happens, what the engine sounds like. So it goes, it kind of increases in pitch and then decreases. And that's just another way to add detail. So that was what I did for the turn. Now the entire engine itself goes through a couple different effects on the entire group, and these effects are here to cement the entire engine together as a cohesive sound, and not have it sound like a bunch of hissiness and a bunch of, you know, air conditioner sounds mashed together with chorus effects on, which is possible. You can, I mean, I've designed many things that don't sound great altogether. This individually, the layers are okay, but then when you put them all together, it gets annoying. So that's one thing I wanted to avoid. And here's the effects that are on here, or here's the full group rather, without any of the effects. So the first thing I added was this speaker. It's like a cabinet emulator. It kind of like allows you to pick a speaker configuration in Ableton. It's like something that you typically use on a guitar to put it in a room, or to put, you know, before your reverb, you'd throw this on something to make it sound like it's coming from a speaker. But I chose it here less for the speaker effect and more for a subtle gluing effect. You'd likely not hear a difference if I A-beat it, but psychologically it just makes sense to me that I would add a little bit of a speaker effect to everything. I don't know why, it just felt right to me, so I did it. Here's the difference. Actually, I'll crank it up so you can hear what it really adds, and then we'll move it back down and you can hear the difference. So with 100% cranked, it makes it sound horrible. But like at a subtle 15%, it kind of sends everything through an effect that all lives in the same space. So it kind of, if I A-B the 15, it might be more subtle, but I think it adds a lot of character to the sound. Next we have a saturator. This is just a very subtle hot tube saturator. It's not so subtle actually in the higher volumes, but it is a, you know, pretty low dry wet combo there on this saturator. And then we have an OTT. This is something that I use in almost every lesson video at one point or another. It's another thing that sounds amazing when you crank down the amount and just let it glue things together. It's basically a multi-band compressor plugin, or a preset rather, that just cranks everything to oblivion. So it squashes everything down like crazy. I'll show you what the engine would sound like at 100%. So obviously that's ridiculous, but you know, it kind of shows you what it's doing. I like to turn it down to like 12% or 10% and just let it bring everything in the entire group like sort of back down to or within the same I don't want to say dynamic range, because it doesn't quite have a crazy effect on the dynamic range of a sound, but it just makes, if there's one thing that's a little too loud, it'll bring it down in relation to one thing that's a little too quiet, and it just brings everything glued together a little bit more. But this is not a transient heavy sound, so I'm not quite worried about the dynamics as much as I am just the glue. And that's what these three effects all really are there for. And then proximity, this is a plugin that I use a lot. This is here to just spatialize things. It's kind of a plugin that emulates air absorption over a distance. So I have this cranked down. This is a free plugin that I highly recommend you try out. It's really cool. And this is just to give distance to the whole thing to make sure the engine doesn't sound like it's quite, you know, right next to the camera. Here's what it sounds like if I scroll past the if I scroll this knob during the engine. I'll show you what it does. So you might be thinking, oh, 6 sounded more intense and more hardcore. I agree with you, but I didn't want to use it because it's kind of too intense and too hardcore and sounds too stereo. It sounds too wide. And so I'd rather have something that sounds good and in the space than something that sounds hardcore all the time and like super in your face. So that's just what I prefer to do with this plugin. But yeah, you could, you know, in your own designs, you can mess around with cranking up the distance and seeing what you like. But I just wanted to use it as a way to spatialize the sound and bring it off of the mic a little bit. And then we have the last thing, which is the sidechain compressor. And this brings me to one of the things I was going to talk about with the mix, which is which I'll actually save for last because it's more to do with these grouping tracks. But this is to emulate the mix that would occur in a game engine where the nitrous, which is more important for the time that it plays, you know, to duck this engine sound. So we'll talk about that at the end. But that's what that is. So then last we have this nitrous layer, which sounds like this. So we have the original boost sound, and then like here you can see if you scroll slowly through the video, you have like a subtle backfire sound that happens. There's like a subtle jet that comes off the engine there. So yeah, this is another sound similar to the Spawn vehicle sound, which is very heavily based on layering and just picking sounds and figuring out what works. So the transient is from an explosion. It's from a construction kit explosion from Boom Library. And let me quickly unfreeze these tracks. Show you. Yeah, so we have this explosion. That's the transient. And then we have, actually there's like a subtle lead in. If you take a look at these three tracks right here, there's this subtle mechanical lead in sound, which is, it's kind of like my version of like, you know, onboard the actual Sparrow, someone clicking a button that's like sends the actual fuel to the engine. So that's what I wanted to show there. Is like, it's almost like sounds like a valve opening and a bunch of gas running through, and like the click at the beginning is like sort of indicative of like a control on the actual Sparrow itself, like the button you'd click. So then we go into the explosion, and then the layers all after that, these 6 layers here, are combinations of the idea that I was talking about before with the engine distortion, the subtle sort of like popping engine distortion in these 2 tracks. And then that's in combination with these sort of like this is actually the same fan power down sound that I used in the Spawn vehicle sound, and that in combination with the sort of like these 2 sounds of blenders gurgling water, which I thought was a cool way to add texture. So then I'm adding actually the same tremolo effect to this that I'm adding to the main engine itself. And that brings, the tremolo is always a way to bring something from like, you know, simple fan sound to like sci-fi vehicle. It just gives it a texture. It's such a Star Wars thing. It gives it like a the feeling that it's part of a moving gear or like a moving engine. So I use that a lot. I think I use that in plenty of other video lessons. Then we have this sweetener, this impact sweetener, which is there for the low end. It's originally an explosion that sounds like this. But I already have the transient, and although that sounds cool, it's really not doing its job, because what this is here to do is provide low end. And I even had to curb the low end off a little bit because it was too intense. But yeah, that's what this is here for. And we already have the transient from the cement explosion, so I brought I cut the transient off of this sample and really just focused on fading in a cool little low thump, and I think it does its job a lot better. Here's what the transient sounds like soloed with the low end. I think it adds a nice little bed for all the other sounds to sit on. And then, like I said, there's 2 sounds of blenders, which is, I don't know. I mean, you know, nothing in the rule book. This is, you can't make a sci-fi vehicle sound with a blender gurgling water. So yeah, that's these layers. Then at the end here, this backfire I knew should probably share the same transient as the original. but it doesn't have to share the same level of intensity after the fact. It doesn't have to have the same blender sounds or long tail, because it's not adding momentum to the ship. It's really just there doing its job, kind of like as a backfire. So I had more of a lead-in sound, more of a whoosh lead-in, and then just basically added the transient and a very subtle Saturn engine, and then the blender, the mechanical part. So yeah, that's the basics of this nitrous layer. And with that, we sort of conclude the deep dive look at all these tracks. And now I wanted to just briefly talk last about the mix itself. There's two ways that I think about in general doing a mix for a small clip like this, especially for an episode of Waveform. And the first one is to manually add gain automation to all of these groups. So when I finish, designing all these groups, so these 6 groups here, I'm trying to think, so what groups are going to want to be present no matter what, like for example the nitrous you want to hear every time, and then what groups are less important when those things are happening. So the ambience, for example, we can duck the ambience when the engine turns on, and we can duck the ambience when the nitrous plays, and when the physics out, when you impact the wall, stuff like that. So you can think about it in that one way, where you would go back and say manually, okay, I'm going to go in and add some gain automation to the ambience track and duck it like this when we can just take a utility or in any DAW, you just add a gain plugin, show the automation in a new lane, and just say, hey, when this nitrous sound plays, I'm going to duck the ambience like this, and I'm going to make it sound as good as possible, add a curve to it. But I don't really like doing that for a couple of reasons for these game-related clips. And it sounds great, and people do that all the time, and it's sort of like it's a great way to pick and choose what you want to do. But I like doing it with sidechain compressors, which is the other way that I think of when I'm talking about doing it for a game, because that's the way it would actually work in a game mix. There's no manual automation in a game mix because everything's happening in real time. So what I do is instead add sidechain compressors and group things the same way I would in a game engine, and just say, okay, nitrous is really important. Nitrous is going to duck ambience. So sidechain from engine, or actually I didn't sidechain from the engine. I didn't sidechain from nitrous. I sidechain from the engine. But the engine itself has a compressor on it that gets a sidechain from the nitrous group and says, okay, whenever this nitrous plays, we're going to duck the engine. And you can hear when you listen, actually, because if we solo it, we won't get the same sidechain effect. But you can see when you solo the 2 of these, and you look at the engine compressor, the engine compressor is activated when the nitrous plays. And so I like doing it this way because it lets it sort of be an example for the lesson, for the episode, and also kind of emulates what an in-game mix would sound like a little bit better than the manual compression would. Sometimes manual compression sounds a lot better, like for dialogue when you're manually removing S's or manually compressing things, but it doesn't sound quite as good, in a clip where a lot of things are happening at once. It doesn't sound quite as gamey. It can sound over rehearsed. So I avoided that and went for this method, which is actually coincidentally a lot faster to do. So that's the basic setup for this entire group. And then on the group, I have some basic isotope mastering. This is just some compression and limiting. And then I have the 2 convolution reverbs, which we talk about in the episode, which are I believe Ableton presets for outdoor reverb and a tunnel reverb for the cave. So yeah, that's the basics of this session. Thank you for being a supporter on Patreon, and let me know if there's anything else I can elaborate on in the comments. If you give me a comment, I'll respond. I'll do my best to read it. And yeah, this is the basics of this session. I'm going to try and do more of these video lessons I'm going to try and do one for every new Waveform episode that I make. So let me know, if you don't like one of the things you see in this episode, or if you think that they could be better, just let me know. Shoot me a Twitter message or a comment here, and I'll try and make sure these are better every time, because I'm still not quite sure, if you guys are liking these or not. So yeah, that's the best I can do for today explaining this. I'll see you guys soon, hopefully, with a new episode. And thanks for watching. Thanks for being a supporter on Patreon. And have a good one. Bye.